I am telling you this because pretending it did not happen would be easier. And because once you hear what we lived through, you will understand why some men never speak about the winter of 1924. We were a supply team sent out to deliver food and fuel before the route disappeared under ice. And at first there was nothing wrong. No signs, no sounds, no reason to believe we were anything but alone. The trail was clean, the men were calm, and the cold behaved the way cold always does. Slow, honest, predictable. Then the feeling started. Not fear, not panic, but the sense that our pace was no longer ours to control, that something unseen was matching us step for step, not behind us, not ahead of us, but exactly where it needed to be. We swore we were being hunted because that explanation gave us something to point at, something to blame. The truth was worse. Nothing chased us, nothing hurried, nothing needed to. Before I go any further, listen to me carefully. If you believe stories like this are just legends, then this channel is not for you. But if you suspect that some stories survive only because someone refuses to stay silent, then stay here. Subscribe now, and when this video ends, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from, because these stories travel further than you think, and I want to know how far this one reaches. What happened next did not begin with teeth or claws. It began with the first choice we justified, and once that choice was made, the Wendigo did not need to follow us anymore. The first thing that failed was not our equipment, and it was not the weather, but the quiet agreement we had with ourselves that every step forward still belonged to us. We left before dawn, sleds heavy with crates, dogs restless but obedient, and men wrapped so tightly in wool and confidence that none of us questioned why the air felt different the moment we crossed the last familiar marker on the route. I remember taking inventory as we moved, counting rations, calculating distance, reassuring myself with numbers because numbers have never lied to me the way instincts do, and because I believed that if everything added up correctly, nothing truly dangerous could happen. By midday, the cold had settled into us the way it always does, slow and deep, not sharp enough to alarm but persistent enough to demand attention. And it was during one of our routine stops that the first man turned around without any clear reason for doing so. He did not shout, and he did not point, but he stood there longer than necessary, scanning the tree line with an expression that suggested he was listening for something he could not yet hear. When I asked him what he saw, he shook his head and laughed it off, blaming fatigue, but his eyes never quite returned to us. And that was when I made the first decision that would follow me for the rest of my life. I told them we were fine. We moved on, and the trail remained clean, so clean that it felt almost deliberate, as though the snow itself had decided to erase anything that might suggest we were not alone. The dogs began to slow despite being well fed, and one of them refused to drink when we stopped again, standing stiff and alert with its ears turned back, watching the space between the trees instead of the men who had raised it. I wanted to believe this was nothing more than animal behavior, the kind of strange but harmless reaction that occurs when the cold stretches on too long, and so I reminded everyone that we were ahead of schedule, that the outpost would be warm, that turning back now would waste precious time. By late afternoon, conversation had thinned into short exchanges, not because we were afraid, but because speaking felt unnecessary, as if something in the air discouraged noise without ever announcing its presence. I felt watched, not in the way a man feels when he senses danger, but in the way one feels when being measured, and I found myself adjusting my pace without realizing it, slowing slightly, then correcting, trying to regain a rhythm that no longer felt natural. When I noticed that the others were doing the same, matching one another unconsciously, I convinced myself it was coincidence. That night, we made camp earlier than planned, and as the fire settled into a steady burn, one of the men finally said the word that had been circling us all day without landing. He said it quietly, almost respectfully, as if naming it too loudly might invite something closer. And when he said Wendigo, no one laughed, and no one asked him to explain. I told them stories had a way of growing teeth in the dark, and I insisted that fear could turn hunger into hallucination. But even as I spoke, I was aware that I was trying to convince myself more than anyone else. We slept in shifts, and I did not dream, because dreams require distance from reality, and whatever was with us did not allow that kind of separation. Morning arrived without relief, bringing light but no warmth, And as we broke camp, I realized with a clarity that unsettled me more than fear ever could, that nothing had changed during the night. Not the snow, not the trees, not the pressure that sat just behind my thoughts, as though something had been waiting patiently for us to wake up and continue. The dogs refused to move at first, and when they finally did, they kept their heads low and their eyes fixed forward, no longer curious, no longer distracted, behaving less like animals and more like men who understand that attention can be dangerous. As the day stretched on, we found the first sign that something had been wrong long before we noticed it. A set of tracks half buried by fresh snowfall that did not belong to any animal I could identify, because they were too large to be natural and too deliberate to be accidental. The spacing between them suggested a gait that was controlled, unhurried, and intentional. And when I measured the distance, I realized with a tightening in my chest that whatever had made them could have caught us easily if it wanted to. I said nothing about that part, choosing instead to tell the others that the snow distorted scale, that the cold played tricks on perception, because admitting the alternative would have required us to reconsider every choice we had already made. One of the men fell behind by midday, not injured, but slower than the rest, his breath shallow and his movements clumsy in a way that could not be blamed entirely on the cold. And when he asked for a longer rest, the group turned to me without speaking. I weighed the numbers quickly, calculating how much daylight we had left, how far the outpost still was, how much food we could spare if we delayed, and I told myself that leadership meant making decisions others could not afford to make. I told him we could not stop. The look he gave me was not anger, but understanding, and that frightened me more than if he had argued, because it meant he accepted the logic of what I was doing even as it worked against him. We adjusted the load, redistributed weight, and continued on, and I felt a strange sense of relief when his footsteps faded slightly behind us, because it meant the group could move more efficiently, and because I did not yet understand what that relief said about me. By late afternoon, the silence had become complete, broken only by the sound of breathing and the steady crunch of snow, and it was then that I realized the feeling of being watched had changed, not grown stronger, but more focused, as if something had narrowed its attention and found what it was looking for. When I glanced back, I did not see a creature, or glowing eyes, or movement in the trees, but I felt certainty settle into me with a weight that made my hands tremble. We were not being followed. We were being evaluated. That night, as the man who had fallen behind struggled to eat, his hands shaking too badly to hold his cup, I understood for the first time that whatever waited with us did not need to hunt, because hunger alone would do the work for it, and that realization marked the moment when survival stopped being a shared goal and became a private calculation. And somewhere beyond the firelight, something patient and ancient waited to see who I would become next. By the third day, the cold had stopped feeling like an enemy and started feeling like a law, something absolute and indifferent that did not punish you out of malice, but simply collected what you failed to protect. And that shift in my thinking was the first sign that I was changing in a way I did not yet have language for. We woke to a gray sky that offered light without comfort, and we moved in silence because speaking wasted warmth, and because every unnecessary sound felt like a confession to the empty wilderness that we were still weak enough to be distracted. The man who had fallen behind, the same man whose eyes had met mine with that quiet understanding, was worse in the morning, his lips cracked, his hands trembling, his gait unsteady in a way that made each step look like an argument with gravity. He insisted he could continue, and I believed he meant it, but I also understood that meaning something does not change what a body can do when it has decided it has had enough. One of the others suggested we make a short shelter and let him rest, not for a full day, not for long, just long enough for him to drink something warm and stop shaking, and the suggestion hung in the air like smoke, visible, fragile, and doomed. I did not say no immediately, because I wanted to appear reasonable, and because I was still performing the role of a man who cared about everyone equally. But in my head I was already rearranging numbers, subtracting hours, dividing rations, counting the daylight we would lose, and when I finally spoke, my voice sounded calm even to me. I told them that if we stopped, the route would close, and if the route closed, none of us would get home, and if none of us got home, then saving one man for a few more hours would have been a sentimental choice that killed everyone. I watched their faces as they absorbed that logic, and I felt something inside me settle, not guilt, not relief, but the cold clarity of a decision that could not be undone. We continued. The dogs began to whine as the day went on, not loudly, but with a thin, persistent sound that seemed to come from a place deeper than fear. And I noticed that even the strongest of them kept glancing toward the trees without turning their heads fully, as if looking directly would be an invitation. The trail narrowed between stands of black spruce, and the shadows there felt thicker than they should have, and I found myself breathing shallower, listening for something I could not name, because the absence of sound had started to feel deliberate, as though the forest had agreed to hold its breath. It was in that narrow stretch that we found the first thing that did not belong to the living world, a strip of fabric hanging from a low branch, stiff with frost, the kind of cloth used in uniforms at the outpost we were supposed to reach. No blood marked it, and that was what disturbed me most, because damage without evidence suggested a kind of carelessness that could only exist when violence was effortless. One of the men reached for it, then stopped, as if his hand had hit an invisible barrier, and we all stood there staring at that small, ordinary thing like it was an omen. No one spoke the word Wendigo this time, but I saw it move behind their eyes, and I felt the same, a slow, creeping certainty that we were not walking toward safety, but into the aftermath of something that had already happened. That night, we camped with the trees too close, because the wind was rising and because the man who was failing could no longer keep up, and the others were not cruel enough yet to leave him behind. I set the watch schedule, and when it was my turn, I stood at the edge of our firelight, staring into the dark until my eyes burned, and I realized something that made the hair on my arms rise under my layers. The dark did not feel empty. It felt occupied and it felt patient. When the wind shifted, carrying a scent I could not place, not rot, not blood, but something thin and metallic like old tools left in damp air, I understood with a cold spike of clarity that whatever was out there was not circling us, and it was not stalking us like an animal. It was simply waiting for us to become desperate enough to do its work for it. The next morning we found proof that we were not imagining it, not because we saw the creature, but because the wilderness finally made a mistake, and in that mistake it revealed a pattern. We broke camp before the sun cleared the tree line, and almost immediately one of the dogs refused to move, planting its paws so firmly into the snow that the harness straps creaked under the strain. The animal's eyes were wide and glassy, and it stared ahead as if the trail itself were a trap. When one of the men stepped forward to pull it, the dog turned its head and let out a sound that did not belong to a dog, a low, strained noise that felt too deep, too human in the wrong way, and the men froze, not because they were superstitious, but because every instinct in the body recognizes wrongness faster than the mind can explain it. I walked forward slowly, telling myself that panic was contagious, that I had to stay steady, that leadership was a posture as much as a choice, and I followed the dog's line of sight into the trees. At first I saw nothing but branches and shadow, and then I saw what the dog had seen. A shape at the edge of visibility where the snow met the dark, tall enough to be mistaken for a tree trunk if you looked quickly, still enough to disappear the moment you doubted yourself. I stared, and the shape did not move. That was the worst part. If it had lunged, if it had charged, if it had made itself a clear threat, we would have done what men always do. We would have reacted, we would have fired, we would have shouted, we would have turned fear into noise and action. But it remained still, and in that stillness it forced us to look at it the way you look at something you cannot afford to acknowledge. My heart hammered so hard that my ribs ached, and I felt sweat gather under my clothing despite the cold, and when I blinked, the shape was gone, not because it fled, but because it no longer needed to be seen. We moved on, but the group's rhythm had changed, tighter now, as if we were all attached by a single invisible rope, and I noticed that the men began to watch one another more than they watched the trees, because in fear, the greatest danger is not always what is outside the circle, but what a man might do when he believes he is running out of time. The sick man fell twice before noon, each fall slower than the last, and after the second, one of the others crouched beside him and whispered something I could not hear. I did not ask what he said, because I already knew. When you have traveled long enough in hunger and cold, mercy stops sounding like virtue and starts sounding like waste, and I hated myself for how easily that thought came. By late afternoon, the wind began to rise, and with it came something else, faint at first, like a voice carried from too far away, and I told myself it was wind in the trees, because that explanation allowed my mind to stay intact. The sound grew clearer as the light faded, and I realized with a tightening in my throat that it was not a voice, but something mimicking the shape of one, repeating a cadence that felt familiar, like speech without words, like someone trying to remember what being human sounded like. One of the men raised his rifle and aimed into the trees, shaking so badly I thought he would drop it, and I put my hand on the barrel and pushed it down, not because I was brave, but because I understood suddenly that noise was what it wanted. I understood that a shot would turn uncertainty into certainty, that blood would turn fear into inevitability, and that if we gave it violence, we would be stepping onto ground where it could finally meet us. We made camp in a hollow where the wind was weaker, and as we huddled close to the fire, the sick man began to cry without making sound, tears freezing along his lashes, and I watched the others look away, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, because in that moment everyone was calculating the same thing. How much longer can he last, and what will it cost us? That night, while the voice in the trees repeated its empty, almost speech, I sat awake and realized that the Wendigo had finally done what it came to do. It had made us start thinking like it. By the 5th day, the idea of rescue had stopped functioning as a future event and had become something abstract, like a word repeated too often until it loses its meaning. And I realized with a dull, creeping certainty that we were no longer moving towards safety so much as moving, because stopping felt like surrender. The man who could no longer keep pace was barely conscious now. His words slurred when he spoke at all, his body swaying on his feet like something already half detached from the will that once animated it, and yet no one suggested leaving him behind, not because we were kind, but because none of us wanted to be the first to say the thing that was already forming in every mind. We rationed more tightly, not because supplies were critically low, but because scarcity sharpens discipline, and discipline makes difficult decisions feel earned rather than cruel. And I hated how easily that logic settled into me. I watched the others chew slowly, deliberately, stretching each mouthful as if time itself could be consumed along with food. And I noticed how often their eyes drifted to the weakest man, not with hunger, not yet, but with calculation, as though he had become a variable instead of a person. The forest closed in again by midday, the trail narrowing until the sled scraped bark, and the sense of being observed intensified, not as fear, but as pressure, like a weight placed gently but firmly on the back of the mind. I realized then that the Wendigo had not appeared to us again, because it no longer needed to, because its presence had moved from the trees into our thoughts, guiding them, reshaping them, turning survival into a series of increasingly narrow options. We found the remains of a campsite that afternoon, little more than a ring of stones and ash pressed flat by snow, and scattered around it were fragments of crates marked with the same symbols as our own supplies. The outpost, they had not been waiting for us. They had been waiting for help that never arrived. One of the men knelt and brushed snow away from the ground, revealing something dark beneath, and he stopped abruptly, his hand hovering as if he had touched heat. It was blood, old and blackened, soaked deep into the earth. I told them we needed to move on, that staying here served no purpose, that whatever had happened was already finished. But the truth was that the air around that place felt thick with memory, heavy with choices made under the same pressures that were now tightening around us. As we left, I felt a strange pull, like a lesson half learned, and I understood that this was not the first group the Wendigo had waited for, and it would not be the last. That night, as the fire burned low, the sick man whispered my name, and when I leaned closer, expecting a plea, he said something else entirely. He thanked me. He thanked me for keeping us moving, for not letting fear turn us back, for doing what needed to be done. His gratitude felt like a knife sliding gently between my ribs, because it meant he believed in me completely, even as my calculations were beginning to erase him. I did not sleep after that. The storm arrived without warning, not dramatic, not violent at first, but steady and relentless, a white curtain that erased distance and flattened the world into something featureless and hostile. We moved blind, guided by memory and instinct rather than sight, and when the sick man collapsed again, there was no hesitation this time, only a brief pause as everyone waited to see what I would say. I looked at him lying there, breath shallow, eyes unfocused, snow collecting on his lashes, as if the land itself were beginning to claim him, and I felt something inside me detach quietly, like a knot finally loosening. I told them we would build a shelter and wait out the storm, but I knew even as the words left my mouth that this was a lie we were telling ourselves to soften what came next. The shelter was crude, hurried, and barely adequate, and as the storm howled outside, the sick man drifted in and out of consciousness, his body shuddering uncontrollably despite the blankets piled over him. Supplies dwindled faster than I had planned, not because of hunger, but because warmth demands fuel, and fuel demands sacrifice. The men spoke in whispers now, and when they thought I could not hear them, I caught fragments of conversation that tightened my throat, words like necessary and inevitable and mercy used in ways that stripped them of meaning. It was then that the voice returned, clearer now, closer, threading itself through the storm like a memory refusing to stay buried. It did not call names. It did not threaten. It simply echoed the rhythm of speech, rising and falling with a cadence that suggested understanding without language, and I realized with a sick clarity that it was not trying to lure us out. It was listening. When the sick man finally stopped breathing, the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm, and no one moved for a long time, as if motion itself might collapse something fragile and unspoken. I closed his eyes with shaking hands, performing the gesture automatically because rituals are easier than thoughts, and because acknowledging death is simpler than acknowledging what death permits. We wrapped his body and moved it outside, placing it downwind, telling ourselves it was temporary, telling ourselves it was respectful, telling ourselves anything that allowed us to delay the next step. As the storm continued to roar, I sat alone and stared at the entrance to the shelter, and I felt it then, not fear, not dread, but recognition, like standing in front of a mirror that shows you not what you are, but what you are capable of becoming. The Wendigo did not appear that night. It did not need to. It was already among us, not in flesh, but in thought, in justification, in the quiet, terrible calm that settles when a line has been crossed and cannot be uncrossed. When the storm finally loosened its grip, it did so without apology, leaving behind a world that looked scrubbed of detail, as if the land itself had been simplified to remove distractions and force clarity. We stepped outside the shelter into air so sharp it felt sharpened on purpose. And for a moment none of us spoke, because speech would have made real the thing we were all thinking, which was that the body lay where we had left it, wrapped and still, no longer a burden, no longer a problem, but not yet what it would soon become in our minds. I told myself we would move it farther away before we left. That distance would preserve dignity. That order mattered even now. And as I said this, I was aware of how easily words could be arranged to sound like care when they were in fact scaffolding for something else. The men listened without comment, their faces hollowed by cold and loss. And as we approached the body, I noticed the dogs pulling back on their leads, not in panic, but in refusal, as if some boundary had been drawn that they would not cross. The body had not changed, and that should have been a relief, but instead it unsettled me, because decay would have closed a door that remained open. And hunger has a way of forcing doors wide when other options vanish. One of the men knelt to check the bindings, his movements slow and deliberate, and when he stood again, he did not meet my eyes. That was when I understood that leadership had shifted without ceremony, not away from me, but deeper into me, into the place where decisions are no longer debated but executed. We left the body where it was. As we resumed our march, the forest seemed to lean closer, branches creaking softly under the weight of snow, and the sense of being observed returned with a sharpness that made my scalp prickle, not because something had moved, but because something had noticed. I found myself thinking less about distance and more about efficiency, less about rescue and more about survival in its purest form, stripped of ideals and padded language, and I hated how natural that shift felt. By midday, the first argument broke the surface, not loud, not angry, but careful, as if everyone involved understood that words could fracture something fragile. One man suggested we should not waste energy pretending the dead were still part of our calculations, and another countered that speaking such thoughts invited consequences, and they both looked to me to resolve it. I told them we would discuss it later, because postponement is often mistaken for wisdom, and because I needed time to decide how much truth the group could bear. The voice returned that afternoon, faint but unmistakable, threading itself through the trees with a rhythm that mirrored our own breathing, and I realized with a shiver that it had learned us, that it understood cadence, pause, restraint. It did not speak words, but it spoke intention, and intention has a way of cutting through reason when conditions are right. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a tightening that came with the knowledge that whatever watched us was not urging haste, because haste leads to mistakes, and mistakes waste opportunities. That night, as we camped, the smell of food carried farther than it should have, and I noticed how often the men's gazes drifted to the dark beyond the firelight, then back to the packs, then away again, as if drawn by gravity they did not want to acknowledge. I lay awake, staring at the low ceiling of the shelter, and I understood that the Wendigo had finally achieved what it had waited for, which was not to terrify us, but to make the unthinkable feel like an option. And once something becomes an option, it does not remain unchosen for long. The decision did not arrive all at once, and it did not announce itself as evil, because true corruption rarely does, preferring instead to wear the mask of practicality until the face beneath is forgotten. We woke to a morning colder than any before it, the kind of cold that steals breath before you realize it is gone. And as we prepared to move, one of the men collapsed without warning, his knees folding beneath him like a structure that had finally exceeded its load. He was alive, but barely, his pulse weak and erratic, his eyes unfocused. And as we gathered around him, the truth settled over us with an almost physical weight, because this was not an unexpected complication, but the inevitable result of everything that had already happened. Supplies were low, energy was lower, and the distance ahead had not shortened simply because we wished it would. I ran the numbers again, slower this time, and for the first time, the conclusion did not resist me. We could not carry him. The men did not argue when I said it aloud, and that silence was more damning than protest, because it meant they had already reached the same place on their own, guided by hunger and cold, and the quiet influence that had been shaping us since the first day. One of them suggested we leave him with food and mark the location, a gesture so hollow it almost made me laugh, and another suggested we stay another night, as if time itself could be convinced to change its nature. I told them the truth. I told them that staying would kill us all, that leaving him was not cruelty but necessity, and as I spoke, I felt something inside me settle completely, a final alignment of thought and action that left no room for doubt. The man on the ground looked at me then, really looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw neither fear nor accusation, but a terrible understanding, as if he recognized the path I was on, because he had been walking it longer than I had. We left him there. As we moved away, the voice rose again, closer now, clearer, and for the first time I thought I heard intent in it, not command, not threat, but approval, and that realization hollowed me out more effectively than any scream could have. The forest seemed to open for us after that, paths clearer, footing surer, as if the land itself had decided we were worth guiding now that we had proven something fundamental. By evening, we stopped without discussion, exhaustion pressing down on us like a shared verdict, and as the fire took hold, one of the men finally said what had been circling us for days. He said that the dead were not using their strength anymore, that nothing should be wasted in a place like this, and as the words hung there, heavy and obscene, I realized with a clarity that made my hands shake that no Wendigo needed to stand among us to complete its work. We were doing it ourselves. I did not answer him right away, not because I disagreed, but because I needed to understand what my silence would mean, and in that pause, I felt the last thin barrier inside me give way. When I finally nodded, it was not dramatic, and it was not loud, but it felt like a door closing somewhere far behind me, sealing off a version of myself I would never reach again. That night, the voice did not return. It did not need to. We had learned the lesson it had been waiting to teach, and from that moment on, the Wendigo was no longer something outside our circle, but something seated quietly within it, patient, satisfied, and very much awake. By the 9th day, time no longer moved forward in a way I recognized, but folded in on itself, compressing moments of action and stretching moments of thought until memory began to lose its edges, and I understood that this distortion was not a symptom of exhaustion alone, but the natural consequence of living too long inside a single, narrowing decision. We traveled lighter now, not because we had shed unnecessary gear, but because what we carried had changed in a way no one named, and the absence of certain weights felt louder than any burden we had left behind. No one spoke about what we had done, not because it was forbidden, but because speaking it would have required us to assign it a shape, and shape gives things limits, and limits invite judgment. Instead, we focused on movement, on breath, on the simple mechanical act of placing one foot in front of the other, as though motion itself could erase intention. I noticed how the men avoided one another's eyes, not out of shame exactly, but out of recognition, because to look too closely was to see a reflection that could not be denied. The forest had changed again, opening into a wide stretch of frozen ground where the wind scoured the surface clean, leaving nothing to hide behind. And as we crossed it, the sense of being observed returned with a force that made my chest ache. I scanned the horizon instinctively, expecting at last to see the creature, to be granted the clarity of a form to blame, but there was nothing there, only distance and sky, and the certainty that whatever watched us no longer needed proximity to exert its influence. It was there, in that open place, that one of the men began to speak, not loudly, not urgently, but with the calm of someone who had reached a conclusion and was simply sharing it. He said that the stories were wrong, that the Wendigo was not a beast that hunted the lost, but a consequence that followed those who abandoned limits. And as he spoke, I felt a tightening in my throat, because he was saying aloud the thing I had been careful not to articulate even to myself. I told him to stop. Not because he was wrong, but because acknowledging the truth out loud felt like inviting something closer, and I was no longer certain that distance still protected us. The others listened in silence, their expressions unreadable, and I understood then that whatever line we had crossed was no longer behind us, but beneath us, supporting every step we took from that point on. That night, as we camped under a sky stripped of stars by cloud, I woke to the sound of breathing that was not my own, slow and measured, close enough to feel, and for a terrible moment I believed the Wendigo had finally come to stand among us. I held my breath and listened, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away, until I realized that the sound belonged to one of the men, standing just outside the firelight, facing away from camp, breathing in rhythm with something unseen. I did not call out to him. I did not ask what he was doing, because in that moment, I understood that interruption would have been an act of violence, not against him, but against whatever understanding he was reaching. And I had already learned that violence, once begun, does not stay contained. When he returned to the fire, his face was calm in a way that frightened me more than panic ever could, and he said nothing. And I knew then that we were no longer waiting for the Wendigo to appear. We were waiting to see who among us would finish becoming it. The 10th day began with a clarity so sharp it felt unreal, as if the world had been simplified again, stripped down to essentials to remove any remaining excuses, and as we broke camp, I realized that I no longer felt fear in the way I once had. Fear implies uncertainty, and uncertainty had been replaced by a terrible, steady understanding of what survival demanded when stripped of all ornament. We reached the edge of the supply route by mid-morning, the markers half buried but still visible, and the sight of them stirred something fragile in the group, a brief, dangerous flicker of hope that threatened to undo the discipline we had built. I forced myself to remain steady, to keep my voice even, because I understood that hope, unmanaged, could be just as lethal as despair, and I told them we were not safe yet, that distance does not forgive what hunger has already rewritten. It was then that we heard it clearly for the first time, not a voice, not a sound made by throat or mouth, but a presence that pressed against the senses, unmistakable and intimate, as though the space around us had grown aware. I stopped walking, and the others did the same, and for a long moment we stood there, suspended between movement and surrender, and I felt something immense and patient settle its attention fully on me. I did not see it. I did not need to. The realization came without words, fully formed and undeniable, that the Wendigo was not interested in our bodies anymore, because bodies were temporary, inefficient, easily lost to weather and time. What it wanted was continuity, a way to move forward without leaving tracks, to persist not as flesh but as principle, carried by those who survived long enough to justify what they had done. And in that moment, I understood why I was still alive. Not because I was strong, not because I was lucky, but because I had proven myself willing. The pressure eased then, not retreating, but settling, like a weight shifted into place, and we resumed walking without speaking, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, each of us altered in ways that would not reveal themselves until much later. The route led us back toward the world of maps and names and rules, and as civilization slowly crept back into view, I felt a hollow open inside me where relief should have been. When we were finally found, when questions were asked and reports were written, we told the truth in the only way we still could. We said we were hunted, and that was enough for them. But now, speaking to you, I understand what we could not say then, which is that the Wendigo never needed to chase us at all, because by the time we reached safety, it had already learned how to walk unseen, carried quietly inside those of us who survived. And if you are still listening, if any part of this story feels uncomfortably close, then you already know why some things do not stay buried. Because once the Wendigo learns you, it does not let you go. People still ask what the Wendigo looked like, as if shape would make this easier to understand, as if giving it antlers or claws or glowing eyes would allow them to keep it at a safe distance. Something fictional, something that belongs to stories instead of memory. I never answer that question, not because I am protecting the truth, but because the truth would frighten them far more than any monster ever could. The Wendigo did not look like anything. It felt like permission. It felt like the quiet moment when hunger explains itself, when fear becomes practical, when survival stops asking for consensus and starts demanding obedience. It felt like the ease with which a line can be crossed when enough reasons are placed in front of it, and the way that ease lingers long after the cold is gone. We told them we were hunted because hunted men are victims, and victims are forgiven. What we could not tell them was that nothing chased us, nothing cornered us, nothing forced our hand. What waited with us only asked one question over and over again in ways that did not require words. How far are you willing to go? If this story unsettled you, if it stayed with you longer than you expected, do not scroll away from it. Leave a comment and tell me what you think the Wendigo really is, because these stories do not survive unless they are spoken, argued, and carried forward by people willing to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, not for entertainment, but because some histories only remain alive when enough people refuse to forget them. And if you find yourself thinking about this later, when the room is quiet, when hunger or fear or necessity asks you to justify something you never thought you would, remember this: the Wendigo does not arrive with teeth. It arrives with reasons. And once you understand that, you will never quite be sure when it is standing beside you, listening, patient, and very much awake.